the most disastrous love affairs in history. Like other Egyptian pharaohs, this pleasure-seeking guy had a lot of money. After all, they were riding on the backs of slaves who farmed the fertile Nile Delta. He had so much money that you cannot imagine. A quick tip, he could even lend money to Rome if he wanted to. Now, you can ask such a powerful guy would control himself, but he didn't. Because our young Ptolemy had a fatal flaw. He was madly in love with a dancing slave girl. Therefore, he lost his mind. If you've got that much money, losing your mind must come free of charge. This slave girl who enslaved Ptolemy also had a business partner, her brother Agathocles. This duo first eliminated the biggest obstacle on their way, Queen Arsinoe III. According to gossips in the palace, the queen had been poisoned by them, and now Ptolemy's mistress is gaining power. If you were in his shoes, what would you do? My guess, you'd be pretty shocked. Only a few months after his wife's death, in 204 BC, Ptolemy IV also became ill. Although records cite natural causes, ancient historian Polybius believed it was a case of poisoning. Well, he kicked the bucket either way. While the 5-year-old pharaoh Ptolemy V appeared before the people in ceremonial displays, the pair had already begun emptying the treasury. But I believe the unhappy citizens were not as naive as Ptolemy IV, and they saw everything as usual. And the whispers in the palace corridors increased violent shouting, and riots erupted in the streets. Eventually, the pharaoh's mistress and brother were caught and, according to Polybius, lynched by the people. Agrippina the Younger, a 38-year-old woman famous for her beauty. She was the 4th wife of Emperor Claudius. My stomach churned a little when I read this, but Claudius was Agrippina's uncle. Yes, that's right. Such things were normal in Rome at the time. Now, the overly ambitious Agrippina had a son from her previous marriage, Nero. But Claudius also had a son, Britannicus. Claudius wanted Britannicus to become the emperor after him. Agrippina, however, had already begun making plans to get rid of both Britannicus and Claudius. But a conspiracy cannot be created by one person alone. Pallas, Agrippina's very special advisor, was the palace secretary. The special relationship between the two was well known in the palace, but no one could talk about it. Pallas knew Locusta. She was Rome's most famous poisoner. The woman's resume was full of poison murders. Pretty impressive CV, if you ask me. All of the emperor's meals were checked by tasters. Still, they found a way around this obstacle, when the only person who prepared for him was the chef, Helotus. However, Agrippina also brought Helotus into the conspiracy, either with money or threats, or both. One evening, the mushrooms served to the emperor looked delicious as usual. But after a while, Claudius began to sweat heavily, his stomach churned, then his face suddenly changed. Locusta had obviously worked hard. A doctor inserted a feather into Claudius's mouth to make him vomit, but there was a problem with that too. October 13th, AD 54. Claudius's love of mushrooms changed the fate of Rome. Yes, mushrooms. Come on, can something like mushrooms really take over the world? Agrippina wasted no time in locking Britannicus in his room, and when morning came, she brought 17-year-old Nero before the Senate. "Your new emperor," she said. The Senate didn't resist because the guards were everywhere and they were under Agrippina's control. Agrippina, who taught her son the art of scheming very well, was also killed by Nero a few years later. It is believed that her last words were, "Strike my womb," because this monster came out of that womb. So what happened to Britannicus? He was poisoned by Nero. Nero later burned Rome, killed his own wife, wanted to be an artist, and finally committed suicide. Agrippina's genes were clearly very powerful. The apple didn't fall far from the royal tree. The Thomas Arden incident was much talked about in England at the time. Plays were written, novels were published, operas were composed. Like other English landowners, he was very wealthy. He owned the largest estates in the town of Faversham. He was also the mayor. In other words, he had everything. His wife Alice was, if you will, intoxicated by power, a beautiful, ambitious, and unsatisfied woman in pursuit of new pleasures. This Alice was seeing Mosby, a lowly tailor in her husband's house, right under his nose. Mosby was not only poor, but also a tailor. He was a servant of the Arden family. Divorce was nearly impossible in Tudor England. For Alice to be free of her husband, he had to die. Alice and Mosby hatched a cunning plan and tried to kill Thomas 14 times. 14 times. At this point, it's basically ranked mode. First they poisoned his wine, but Thomas didn't like the taste and didn't drink it. They gave him poisoned soup and he vomited. They put more poison in his food, but he didn't die. The man was quite resilient. He recovered every time. This reminded me of King Mithridates of Pontus. Mithridates, fearing poisoning by Rome, developed immunity by ingesting low doses of poison daily. Or so historians say. Anyway, realizing the poison wasn't working, the poisonous lovers hired hitmen named Black Will and Shakebag. Just as the pair were about to attack, a merchant's cart happened to pull up right in front of Black Will, blocking the road. Thomas, unaware of everything, disappeared from view. What are the odds? Undeterred, Alice and her team tried again, setting a trap at the door entrance, trying to bring Thomas down, but it didn't work again. After 14 failed attempts, Alice, now completely mad, gathered her team and ordered one more attempt. Alice coaxed Thomas into playing backgammon. While the two were playing, Alice signaled to the other killers. That was the cue. Mosby, Black Will, Shakebag, and Alice's servants suddenly pounced on Thomas. The man tragically lost his life. The killers thought everything was back to normal, but Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Within a few days, local authorities got involved. They searched the house. They found blood. Alice, Mosby, Black Will, Shakebag, and all the conspirators were arrested. All except Black Will were executed. Black Will fled to Holland, but committed another crime there. Ultimately, he was caught and executed too. Remember, the higher the heights you reach, the longer the fall from the top. Tudor England was rife with intrigue. Frances Howard was married to an earl when she was 13. Over time, she realized there was a problem. Her husband, the 3rd Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, was useless in bed. Thinking, I deserve better, Frances immediately started seeing someone named Robert Carr. Meeting in secret rooms in the palace, the two began plotting to get rid of the Earl. Frances knew divorce was nearly impossible, so she went to court to prove the marriage had never taken place and claimed she was a virgin. The Earl went mad. I am perfectly healthy, he said. But Frances proved her claim. How? She underwent a virginity examination in front of 12 doctors. Yes, our 20-year-old countess really did have herself examined by 12 doctors and proved she was a virgin. You want to see documentation? You sicken me. After divorcing her husband, Frances began preparations to marry Robert. But Robert's closest friend, Sir Thomas Overbury, thought Frances was not suitable for Robert. He must have seen the dark side within her. Upon learning of the conversation between the two friends, Frances began to hate Overbury. She believed that unless she got rid of him, the marriage would not take place. Using her influence, she had Overbury imprisoned in the Tower of London in April 1613 on charges of conspiracy. The rest was easy for Frances. With the help of her close friend Anne Turner, an expert in poisons, she began to slowly poison Overbury through the meals she sent him. And finally, the man died. With her mind at ease, Frances began to live a perfect life with Robert, filled with parties, balls, and palace intrigues. They were very happy. But one day, a guard at the tower began to have pangs of conscience. He suspected that something might have been put in the food. He went to King James. He told him everything. James couldn't believe it at first, but he launched an investigation. Overbury's body was exhumed and an autopsy was performed. The result? He had been poisoned. Everyone involved in the incident was caught red-handed. Anne Turner was executed. Francis and Robert were initially sentenced to death, but King James pardoned them and their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. Francis and Robert were placed in separate cells in the Tower of London. 6 years later, King James pardoned them both and they were released. But Robert now hated Francis. He believed she had ruined his life. Francis died at 42, a lonely, forgotten, and hated woman. Robert lived 13 more years. His last words before dying were, "I wish I had never met that woman." I think the man was right, but he was a little too late. Regret weighs heavy. Look closely at this photograph. It was taken by journalist Tom Howard during Ruth Snyder's execution. He secretly attached a camera to his ankle. Talk about dedication to the craft. Albert Snyder. He was a boring but good man. He loved his wife. He was a rich man who worked as an art editor for Motorboating magazine. On July 23, 1915, he made the mistake of his life by marrying a woman 12 years younger than him named Ruth Mae Brown. In fact, his biggest mistake was taking his wife's advice and taking out a $100,000 life insurance policy. As you might expect, the man didn't suspect a thing. Beautiful Ruth, tired of her husband, met Judd one day at a restaurant. The pair, who met in hotels and sometimes at Ruth's house while Albert was at work, became increasingly attached to each other. One day, Ruth said to Judd, "Let's get rid of my husband and get $100,000 from the insurance. We'll share the money." But Ruth and Judd were perhaps the most incompetent killers in history. Just like in the Thomas Arden case mentioned earlier, they tried 16 times but failed. 16 attempts. That's not even incompetence anymore, that's commitment. First they cut the brakes on Albert's car. Albert noticed and had them repaired. Then they put sleeping pills in Albert's coffee. They didn't put enough in, so the man just fell asleep. They left the gas stove on. Albert woke up and turned it off. After failed attempts like this, Ruth changed the plan and they decided to shoot him. The plan was simple. When Ruth and Albert returned home from the party, Judd, who was hiding in the house, would come out and shoot Albert. It went exactly as planned. On the night of March 19th, 1927, Ruth and Albert returned home and went to bed. Confident that Albert was asleep, the pair shot him. After a struggle, the man lost his life. To make it look like a robbery, Judd tied Ruth up and took a few worthless items from the house before leaving. In the morning, neighbors who heard Ruth's cries for help immediately called the police. Noticing inconsistencies in the story, homicide detectives questioned Ruth and of course she confessed everything. So this pair, who always failed at murder, also failed at making it look like a robbery. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, well, they certainly tried. Then the police caught Judd. Brought to trial, the pair blamed each other. The jury reached a verdict in 98 minutes, and both were sentenced to death. On January 12, 1928, they were executed by electric chair within minutes of each other.